Hey guys, so now we're talking about European civilization from 1871 to 1914. Um, so this is the first of three chapters in Palmer, and this explores economy and politics, pretty much primarily. But there's a lot. So keep in mind that there's going to be a lot of overlap. Basically, we're going to go from 1871 to 1914, and then back again. We have to go like there's so many things that happen in this time period that it's going to get a little confusing. For example, the scramble for Africa starts basically in the 1870s. We don't go through that on this in this chapter. There's there's a ton of thought ideology, right? I mean, Darwin, Nietzsche, the progressions in communism and socialism, Freud, for example. I mean, and all the art stuff that's going on right at this in this time period. We're not getting to that today, okay? But we will try and talk about how European civilization from a political and an economic standpoint seemed unstoppable. Was just kind of even in this time period where there's a pretty much a long economic depression, there's still crazy amounts of growth. There's people moving around. There's increasing democracy. There's rising population. There's military advances, technological advances, industrial growth, growing wealth at home and abroad, the export of capital. I mean, like you name it, and it's a relatively very peaceful time. There's no big war. The last big war was the Franco-Prussian War that let Prussia finally become Germany, right? That Germany finally unified in 1870. Okay, so there's a lot of stuff going on, but we will try and get through it. I want to try and remind you of this idea of Orientalism. Now, Orientalism is a cultural concept, but I just want to like make sure that we're kind of keeping this in the back of our minds because this starts to dictate. It's dictating a lot of stuff already. It's dictating interest in the Balkans because of the Ottoman Empire. Think of the Crimean War. Think of like the war for Greek independence, which I want to go into a little bit more in depth in another lecture. But Orientalism, if you just read this in Said's, this was Edward Said coined this term, and in this time period that we're talking about, in Said's analysis, the West essentializes, reduces, or trivializes these societies, namely mostly the Ottoman Empire and the Middle East, Asia. These trivializes these societies as static and undeveloped, thereby fabricating a view of Oriental culture that can be studied, depicted, and reproduced. Implicit in this fabrication, writes Said, is the idea that Western society is developed, rational, flexible, and superior. And I say Greek independence, Crimean Civil War, all this has religious overtones, right? The age-old Islam versus Christianity kind of clash of civilizations idea. But this time period, 1871 to 1914, because of the political advances, because of economic strength, the West starts to think of itself as the West. The West starts to think of itself as something that is modern, that is better than everybody else. So what is the West, right? A couple things that Palmer goes into: materialism, right? Stuff, the standard of living. Everybody just has more stuff. The working class, even their standard of living is improving. And we'll get into this when we get into England and the remarkable social welfare advances that they make in the latter half of the 19th century, later in this lecture. Liberalism, so materialism being just stuff that makes people's lives better, right? Tea kettles and I mean, you can just think about, forks. I mean, forks, as we know from Quiz Up, were once banned by the Catholic Church, right? So, not to trivialize any kind of like thinking on that, but I mean, it's just, there's an embracing of materialism. Liberalism, natural rights, constitutionalism, we know all that. Industry, science, reason, and progress. Of course, reason is along with liberalism as well. Political stability, Great Britain as the model. Okay, that's the goal. It doesn't always happen, but that's the goal. Civilization versus the backward barbarians, right? The West is civilized. Everybody else is not. And I love this Cecil Rhodes quote. I mean, I don't love it, but I just think it sums everything up. He was an English entrepreneur and basically wanted to build a railroad from Egypt to South Africa, and we'll get to that when we get to the scramble for Africa. But the Rhodes scholarships are named after him. But he said, "I contend that we are the finest race in the world, and that the more of the world we inhabit, the better it is for the human race. Just fancy those parts that are at present inhabited by the most despicable specimens of human beings. What an alteration there would be if they were brought under Anglo-Saxon influence." Now, this gets into stuff like social Darwinism. We're not going to get there yet. We're getting there in chapter 15, and we're going to do a roundtable with like Herbert Spencer and all these people, and we're going to try and figure out what these people were thinking. But I just wanted to put that out there. Okay, so kind of went into this a little bit more. I thought this was appropriate to put up here. It's a painting, a realism painting, Orientalist painting from the time period. Higher standard of living equals materials and pride, right? It's about pride in many aspects. Racial pride, that happens a little bit later, but national pride, of course. Food, clothing, shelter, sanitation, transport, ocean liners, railroads, streetcars, technology, electricity, telegraph, navigation, all this stuff. Ideals derived from Christianity but secularized. And this goes into paternalism, right? The idea that we are civilized in the West and that everybody else needs to get to where we are, and we need to help them because they're little infant human beings that don't understand what it is to be civilized, so we need to help them, right? That paternalistic instinct. Not instinct, but that idea. Isaac Taylor, Ultimate Civilization in 1860. These relics of barbarism that we've, in the West, somehow by 1860 overcome, right? That science has usurped superstition, and that we've moved on, Europe has moved on from polygamy and infanticide, legalized prostitution, capricious divorce, immoral games, torture, caste systems, and slavery, right? All to a certain extent, of course. Also, this era is the rise of sociology. Remember, Auguste Comte, and positivism is essentially sociology, right? The idea that you have to back up your claims with evidence. You have to analyze evidence of society and see how you can make it better, right? I mean, that's kind of the legacy of utilitarianism and Jeremy Bentham. Like, let's look at everything from a scientific approach and modify it as needs to be. So therefore, sociology starts to confirm the numbers that they find confirm that or seem to confirm that Europeans have superiority. And in many ways they do. That's the thing. As I say down here, despite apparent hubris by Europeans for believing that they were superior by nature to other peoples, they were, at this point, the most powerful people on the planet. The death rate and infant mortality rate are decreasing. Life expectancy and literacy rates are increasing. Productivity of labor in Western Europe outpaces any in the world, right? At one point, someone in the Netherlands is like 10 times as productive in agriculture as someone in Albania, right? Even in 1890 or 1900, something like that. So it's still very, and I pose the question down here because I think it's interesting. Are there parallels between this time period for Europe and 1945 to the present for the United States? So I remember that we're talking about the inner zone and the outer zone, okay? So the inner zone, you can kind of see here. Britain, Scotland, France, Northern Italy, right? Germany, of course, Belgium, Netherlands, maybe a little tiny Catalonia, a little bit, a tiny bit of Spain right here, Catalonia. tiny bit of Austria, okay, Denmark, but that's the inner zone. Okay, so the inner zone being industrial, railroads are concentrated. Wealth is concentrated, highest standard of living, most capital, most scientific activity, low death rate, all this stuff. Not universal literacy, I would take that with a grain of salt. Not universal yet. I mean, like, think about Paris here, and then think about some town down here, right? Not going to be the same literacy rates. So the outer zone, anything else, is going to be agricultural, lower rates of illiteracy, and life expectancy. But keep in mind that it's not all, it's not all railroads crisscrossing everything, right? It's not all railroads just everywhere. There's still urban centers and agricultural areas, right? So where this kind of inner zone, outer zone is like plays out more locally. But this concept of an inner zone and an outer zone starts to kind of go out exponentially around the world, right? So when we get to, especially when we get to the height of imperialism and the height of European dominance around the world, you have the ideas of a core, right? An industrial core, which this remains, and then a periphery. It's the same kind of thing. It's a historian named Emanuel Wallerstein came up with this concept that Europe remains the industrial core, and then the rest of the world becomes the periphery, right? So therefore, the inner zone, produces all the stuff and has all the wealth, but the outer zone is agricultural, poor, illiterate. The wealthier the landlords, they make living selling raw materials to the inner zone, right? The periphery sells the raw materials to the inner zone, but then they don't really have that much ability to buy all the stuff that the inner zone makes. And this is the problem that Marx sees with capitalism, right? That capitalism will end up overproducing, and then the outer zone, or what the markets that capitalism thinks it has, won't come to fruition, and therefore everything just crashes, right? The boom and bust cycle of capitalism. Okay, and that happens in this time period a little bit. There's a long depression, what's called the long depression. I'll get to that. But the outer zone is very much dependent on the inner zone for technology, for knowledge, for kind of the standards of modernity, and we're still seeing that today. We're still seeing the ramifications of that today. So let's talk about demography, right? The increase of Europeans. Okay, so the basic question: increasing population. Was Malthus wrong? Was Thomas Malthus wrong? Basically saying, remember, Thomas Malthus says, if you imagine an XY graph here, that population is increasing exponentially, but food supply only increases arithmetically. Maybe he didn't account for technology, allowing for higher productive rates in food, but who knows? Maybe Malthus is still there's still something to be said for his theories. Who knows? Okay, so population. I'm going to talk about the European family pattern, and basically how much and why did European population increase in the 19th century and then stabilize into the next. So you're going to want to probably get out your book, your Palmer book, if you have it. Get out your Palmer book and turn to page 566, because 566 has this graph that's pretty amazing. It's from 1650 to present day, really. It's estimated population of the world by continental areas. And essentially, since the end of the 30 Years' War, 30 Years' War ends in 1648. After that time period, you have an amazing, amazing population growth in Europe. From 1648, essentially, it reaches its highest percentage of world population around 1900. So if you're looking at page 566, right, you'll see at the top, in 1650, Europe has essentially 100 million people. By 2000, the year 2000, it has 729 million people. But the biggest increase is between 1650 in 1900. 100 million people to almost 400 million people. That's a lot. That's a lot of growth. Okay, so some reasons, some multiple causes for this growth. Cessations of civil war, ending of all those religious wars, right? Those religious wars were totally destructive. A reduction in foreign wars. Remember, a lot of the wars of the 18th century, the War of Spanish Succession, the War of Austrian Succession, those were limited wars. It's not like, they were for certain territories. They didn't have like thousands and thousands and thousands of casualties, right? It's only when you get to the Napoleonic Wars that you have a big increase of like really huge, yucky wars. But then everything dies out a little bit and it becomes kind of limited wars again. Think of the Franco-Prussian War. Think of the Austrian-Prussian War in the 1860s, 1870, right? Those are limited wars. Another reason, the end of the plague, medicinal advances in technology, the development of smallpox vaccine by Edward Jenner in 1798. That's a big one. Smallpox was a huge killer. Agricultural and transportation improvements, right? So you get more food and more ability to move that food around to where it's needed, where the market dictates, right? Increased productivity and ease of moving food, improved sanitation in the cities, right? They're no longer throwing their stuff out the window into the streets, and increased ability of Europeans to import food, okay? So this demography is an important factor in European dominance. By 1900, they're nearly 1/3 of the world's population. That's big. So when you have a population like this, you can, if you're Britain, for example, you can send a bunch of middle class, recent college graduates, you can send them to India to be, captains in the army, right? You have the manpower to do that. Okay, so, but by around 1900, there's a drop. There's a drop, and we're gonna move to this picture because it's a nice little family, nice middle class family. He's got a suit on. She's wearing Victorian dress, right? But they're middle class, but they've got enough money to take a picture, which is that's kind of interesting, I think. But why, after 1900, there's a drop in the French birth rate, and by 1870, I'm sorry, the drop in the French birth rate happens by like 1830. They start going down. In 1870, Germany had replaced France as the most populous state on the continent. And slowly but surely, by 1900, every European country is kind of stabilized in the birth rate. And why then is a reduced birth rate a sign of progress? Why is it a sign of civilization? Ideally, not ideally, but historians have said that it means that fewer babies need to be born to support a family, and that fewer babies need to be born in order to survive. So family size dropped from about 10 to an average of 5 or 6. And this creates a whole different family dynamic, right? Not only does it do something incredible and life-changing and like kind of paradigm shifting for women, that women are no longer stuck in an endless cycle of childbearing and child rearing, right? I mean, you have a middle-class family, they might stay with 2 kids, right? They don't need the kids for labor, and by the 1880s, 1890s, there's compulsory education, so it costs more money for them to house and clothe and feed these kids, right? I mean, think about what we're doing here at King. I mean, like, what your parents are doing at King with, sending you guys to school and sending you guys to college eventually. I mean, you don't want to send 10 kids to college. You must rather send 2 kids to college. So there's a totally different family dynamic, right? So this is called the European family pattern. Um, they marry later, and uh, the non-marriage, most people marry. So they marry later, and most people marry. When women marry later, this naturally leads to fewer children as the childbearing years are reduced. Um, this also is impromptu a impulse to have like some kind of economic foothold before you get married, right? The idea that you want something in the bank before you settle down. um, so you're not only reducing the population by doing that, but you're also reducing poverty, right? So that you're not having 10 kids and remaining impoverished, right? You have a better chance of moving up. Um, Also, there's very good advances in contraception in this time period, and this filters down to the lower classes. This also has something to do with the secularization of society and the fact that Protestantism is going strong, and that Catholic societies are becoming somewhat secularized, even though that it's against Catholic doctrine. Um, and then there's also the proliferation of the Napoleonic Code. Remember, after the Napoleonic Wars, like he basically exports the Napoleonic Code. Um, he abolishes the Napoleonic Code abolishes primogeniture. Primogeniture is the idea that primogeniture, right? That the firstborn son gets all the stuff, gets all the land. He abolishes that. The Napoleonic Code abolishes that, and subsequently, the division of family lands goes to all the children. So if you reduce the number of children, you give them a better chance of economic security. Okay. Another reason is urban life. Urban life tends to reduce the family size because of crowded living conditions, right? And child labor becomes illegal, so children can no longer be economic aids, right? I mean, children used to be just workers on the farm, right? Now they're going to school and they can't work in the factories anymore. So these legal requirements for keeping kids in school make them economically dependent on their families for longer. Okay. All right. So cities and city life. Let's move on to that. Um, so people can come more easily into the cities from the countryside because of the railroads. A ridiculous number of cities have more than 1 million people now by 1870 to 1914. Yes, there's an impersonal tone, right? That people are less tied to traditional communities, attitudes, and therefore they form new identities and take on new ideas. There's the growth of literacy. You can get a newspaper more easily. You can get an education more easily. You can exchange ideas with your next door neighbor, right? While there's some sense of isolation and anonymity in the city, there's the ability to start again, fresh, right? I mean, and like I'll give you a statistic. In the UK in 1830, 2/3 of people lived in towns that had less than 20,000 people. By 1914, 2/3 lived in towns that had over 20,000 people. I mean, cities become a way of life. This close proximity allows socialism to spread easily, especially in times of economic downturn, because usually it's in times of economic downturn that socialism starts to there are grumblings of socialism. Um, Also, yellow journalism, right? Yellow journalism proliferates in this kind of area. There's no how should I say it? There's no regulation of media at all. Not at all. Meaning like there's obviously censorship and all that stuff, but there's no like ideal of journalistic integrity, right? That you have to like that everything that's printed has to be closely vetted. I mean, there are these like um, these ragtag newspapers that will, you know, kind of explode or be emotional and kind of stoke the fires of certain ideas. Um, so you know, basically sensationalist writing. I don't. I mean, you can make your own judgments as to whether or not that's really improved in the past. You know, 150 years. You know, we can argue about that in class. Um, so there's this other phenomenon though that people are leaving. There's 60 million immigrants from Europe in this time. Um, 60 million people between 1850 and basically, you know, 1914, bringing European culture and civilization around the world. Um, Obviously, it's a lot of people that are dispossessed, Jewish people, Polish people, the Irish. Um, a lot of people come from the British Isles. A lot of people come from Germany, from Russia. And the greatest migration obviously goes to the United States. You can see that here. A few to Canada, a few to Asian, Russia, a trickle to Austria, some to South Africa, the second most to Latin America, but by far the most to the United States. So the different ideas about this are, you know, there's the need for people in the United States, right? I mean, like there are so many jobs because of Western expansion in the United States in the 19th century that there's opportunity. There's absolutely opportunity. I mean, like Carnegie, Andrew Carnegie was a Scottish immigrant, right? I mean, the success stories of immigrants in the 19th century that built themselves up and built ridiculous multinational corporations are that they're real. Those stories are real. So there's opportunity, but there's also the kind of there's a carrot approach, right? Where like you know they're offering the carrot of opportunity, but there's also the stick, which basically means that there's the boom bust cycle of capitalism in Europe. There's famines, right? We've talked about the Great Potato Famine in Ireland in 1848, where the virus takes out all the potatoes and nobody in Ireland can eat, and so they basically all have to leave or die. Um, Political disappointments, right? People exiled after the failures of 1848. Persecution, especially in the case of Jewish people. So also, what allows this to happen, though, is technology, right? Steamships, and then I'll go down here and show the biggest one, the Titanic, right? That sinks in 1912. Steamships become so much less expensive, right? Mostly because of the Bessemer process, like industrial steel, right? I mean, if you Google images of the Bessemer furnace, like this right here, I mean, it's so impressive how they're able to even make those that are then able to make steel. But the other part is that people are able to leave. People are able to leave. Like think to the abolition of serfdom in Russia. Like serfs could literally not leave the land. They are now allowed to leave the land. So they're like, yeah, we're getting out of here, and we're going to the United States or somewhere where we can have a little bit of some kind of opportunity. And it's all done. Most of it is all done on private initiative, right? People scrimping some money together and buying a ticket to get on the Titanic, right? I mean, if you've seen the movie Titanic, like that's kind of that's pretty accurate. That people would, you know, just get on a steamboat and just go. So individual by individual, family by family. That still happens, right? Still happens to this day. Okay, let's move on to the economy. The world economy. We're going to talk about, you know, basically the second industrial revolution, right? The second industrial revolution, where there's more areas that are industrialized in Europe, and things like the Bessemer furnace, as I just said, the Bessemer process, like creating more steel, more housing, more boats, more warships, more guns, and then communications. This is Marconi and the telegraph. Telegraph wire is laid by 1875. Telegraph wire has been laid to India, from Britain to India. There's telegraphs going from Britain to India, which is pretty remarkable. Electricity after 1870. The telephone is coming. Film and radio. Radio is already there by 1870. The telegraph after 1870, the radio arrives. And then let's see. What is this? Oh, this is exported capital. We don't want to see that yet, but we can just kind of keep it on here. So other ideas, other new technologies, right? The internal combustion engine, automobiles and airplanes are coming. The moving from coal to oil, and oil is discovered in Iran in 1908, right? That goes back to my kind of Orientalism idea that that there's that this area of the world remains incredibly interesting, and Europe is interested in it for more reasons than one. Other advances, chemistry, right? Fertilizers, artificial food, synthetic fabrics, TNT. TNT is huge because we can now blow tunnels through the Alps. You can make new canals, right? The Suez Canal, remember, 1869. Panama Canal is made in 1914. Bessemer process, I already talked about that several times. So industrialism really spreads after 1870 to those parts of Europe that, Italy, the northern Italy, the rest of France, Russia. Germany is by 1870 like just surging past its industrial rivals, outproducing Britain in steel by 1900. So this, let's see, this is a graph of Germany versus Great Britain in terms of millions of tons produced of steel and exports. The only country that rivals Great Britain or Germany in this time period is the United States. And Germany is really giving the United States a run for its money by 1900. The United States has new techniques like the assembly line, but Germany, Britain, and the United States, you can kind of see why these are some of the main combatants in the world wars. They have the most steel. There's this idea of free trade, right? Remember, after the Corn Laws of 1846, the repeal of the Corn Laws in Britain, they're on free trade, right? France follows suit in 1860, and basically there's like very low tariffs, if at all, goods flowing freely. Almost all European states imported more than they exported, mostly raw materials and food. Even Britain, with its great manufacturing output, did that. But this is the opposite of mercantilism. Remember that mercantilism was you want to export more than you import. This is totally backwards. This is free trade. Now, Britain pays for a lot of this stuff with invisible exports, okay? Invisible exports are, and let's go back to this graph of kind of exporting capital, because you can see that when it comes to Great Britain, okay, Great Britain, France is the light pink, Germany is the darker pink. I mean, they're exporting capital to the United States. They're exporting capital to Africa and Asia, meaning that they're investing. And like, look how much they're sending to Africa and Asia in this time period. I mean, they are absolutely sending a lot of money abroad, investing in abroad. And a lot of the invisible exports that I just mentioned, the UK, there's so much money in shipping, there's so much money in insurance on that shipping, right, and interest from all the loans that are going back and forth, that just the commerce, investment in the commerce is so lucrative that these invisible exports will be really, really important, right? When, and we'll get to this in 1951, 53, when the UK wants to take out Mohammed Mossadegh in Iran because Mossadegh is trying to nationalize the oil supply in Iran. They basically tell the United States, like, look, like, not only is he hurting our oil sales, but he's hurting our invisible exports. Our invisible exports, meaning the shipping on all that oil, the insurance, the loans, like everything that has to do with the oil industry. It's not just the oil itself, right? So it's the goods, the materials, and then everything that goes into that. So when he was taken out in a coup in 1953, joint MI6 CIA, MI6 being the secret, basically the CIA for Great Britain. Yeah, that's one of the things that the British talk about in the documents. That's what I did my master's thesis on. Okay, so going back to this, export of capital. Essentially, why is the export of capital as important as the export of people to the Europeans, right? And how did it change the nature of industrial capitalism? We're talking about foreign enterprises and bonds. Obviously, the wealthy are investing in foreign enterprises, and the standard of living, as it improves in Europe, is being reinvested in foreign markets in around the world, right? Obviously, industrial workers are kind of bearing the brunt of this, but still their standard of living is increasing. But basically, the idea that Britain, for example, Britain is reinvesting about half of its annual increase of wealth abroad by the 1840s. So this massive export of capital is just as important as the export of people, right? For basically trying to make the rest of the world modeled after the European model, right? That Europe is starting to literally own foreign places and foreign people. They're reinvesting so much, especially Asia and Africa, and this becomes important in the scramble for Africa. India is the crown jewel, as we know, of the British Empire. So all this export of capital is incredibly, incredibly important. Another thing that's important to understand, in the export of capital, going back to this idea of invisible exports, Lloyd's of London becomes the bank, the insurance bank, like just like kind of the center of finance is London. The center of banking is London in the 19th century. So if you get a question like that, 19th century, it's all about London. Gold standard, William Jennings Bryan, his Cross of Gold speech. Basically, the gold standard is a way that every single currency is worth its weight in gold, so to speak. So if during this time period, if you were to take a pound note to Lloyd's of London and say, I want this pound's worth of gold, you would get gold in exchange, right? So that made everything uniform. European and American currencies were now exchangeable into gold and therefore more easily into each other. So the gold standard, being the one true currency around the world, allowed globalization of capitalism, right? Gold values remained generally stable until World War I, right? The acceptance of the inner zone of the gold standard proved advantageous to those countries, but disadvantageous to the outer zone, right? If they don't have the same kind of gold supply. Essentially, this is what William Jennings Bryan is upset about in his anti-gold standard speech. He's saying that the gold standard only only benefits those countries that have already had their stores built up. Like Great Britain adheres to the gold standard after 1821. United States and the Western Europe joined suit in by 1870. It's kind of his cross to bear, so to speak. So, as I said, London is the center of the world economy, and it's not entirely patriotic. It even loans money to Russia in the Crimean War, which the British were fighting against. So, this idea that finance does not always know any national loyalty. Okay, so just to sum this all up, right? This is an era of globalization of industry, not globalization of industry, but globalization of price of capitalism. This is kind of the first wave, creating a world market, creating world competition for the first time, and this is really kind of the greatest achievement of this time period, right? Things like Lipton tea, right? Lipton tea being grown in India, being sold in Chicago, right? The highest Lipton Delicious Tea have gained the highest and only award in the British section at the World's Fair of Chicago, right? And of course you have the Indians riding the elephants, right? And some stereotypical stuff. This is also true, as I said, for opium, right? As I told you about this photo, I found it. These are balls of opium being grown in India, and this is what is pushed into China to open China in a way that, to open China to trade, to basically create a drug problem in China so that Europe has a way in. A couple more things. Keep in mind that there's this kind of what's called the long depression, right? Even in this time of incredible growth, there's a depression that kind of lasts for 20 years. So you see, for example, growth rates of industrial production. Germany, 1850s to 1873, 4.3. Then for 17 years it goes down. Then it goes back up. Same thing in the United Kingdom. Same thing in the United States. But look at that growth rate. That's in the United States. That's pretty insane. France, same thing. Italy, kind of, they're not industrializing before that. And then you can see kind of it slows, the growth. Look in Russia, like the GNP of the great powers jumps from 1860 to 1870, but then really slows down in growth in the next 10 years, 20 years. It even goes down, right? So same thing in France, not so much in the United Kingdom, but same thing in Germany. Not as big of a jump. Not but it's significant enough. But the long depression basically creates the need for people, not for people, but for businesses to merge, to create bigger companies. The typical business is no longer run by families or small, right? That the large impersonal corporation with limited liability becomes the dominant form. Corporations, they seek safety and control, right, over the supplies, and there's nothing stopping them. There's very little stopping them from exploiting this guy working in the steel mill, or from exploiting these guys who are working in tenements, right? Who, just are trying to scrape by, right? And as I said, this is Andrew Carnegie. Ideas of vertical integration, right? Controlling all stages of the production process, and then ideas of horizontal integration, right? As corporations seek to work together to fix prices or control production or markets, right? These are called trusts in the United States, cartels in Europe, where guys like J.P. Morgan and Andrew Carnegie ran vertical integration, ideas of controlling all stages of the production process, and horizontal integration, right? Eliminating competition, creating monopolies. That is a thing. Couple more things. Department stores creep up. La Bon Marché department store in France, in Paris. That's like kind of the benchmark. Just the ability for the middle class and the upper classes to go and buy whatever they want, and all the latest new products. And this pops up on tests a lot. The Crystal Palace, right? That was built in 1851 in London for a technological exhibition outside London, for kind of a World's Fair kind of thing. But it was made of all glass and steel, and it burned down. I don't know what there was to burn, but it burned down later on. But this is kind of the futuristic, like, look at what we can do kind of thing. Um, this is what modernity should look like. And of course, some critics are going to see stuff like this, and they're going to see stuff like the Bon Marché department store, and they're going to say that this new form of capitalism is still feudal, right? In its hierarchy, its centralized structure, with few people at the top like Carnegie, and lots of people at the bottom, right? Carnegie, you got a couple of him, and you got lots of people like this. So keep that in mind, that there's still this undercurrent. Okay, let's move on to. I know this is kind of going rather long. If you want to take a break, I'm gonna move on to political stuff. Okay, so essentially, we're looking at France, the UK, and Germany. Those are the three biggest where democracy makes the most inroads. Um, okay, we've already covered the Paris Commune a little bit, but essentially, after the Franco-Prussian War lays waste to France in 1870, and remember, Bismarck declares the German Empire. Bismarck and William I declare the German Empire in the Palace of Versailles, in the Hall of Mirrors. That's embarrassing. So 1870, we're going to talk about the Paris Commune, why it was important for the foundation, because this is the Third Republic. This is the Third Republic of France, and in 1870, the Second Empire collapses, right? Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, Napoleon III, is gone, right? Captured at the Battle of Sedan. So he's gone. There's, of course, as always, there's revolutionaries in Paris, aren't there always? So they proclaim a republic, and in the next year, as the Germans, are basically like, look, we're gonna stay here until you guys figure this out. They decide to lift their occupation with Bismarck's permission, as he said, Bismarck presides over the elections that are held for a national assembly, and these are elected with universal male suffrage. Okay, but Paris is not always the barometer of French feeling, right? Paris is just one place. Paris does not always equal France, and while Paris votes overwhelmingly for Republicans and socialists and kind of more radical liberals, the rest of the country votes for monarchists. So this is a problem. So the city of Paris basically refuses to accept these elections and the authority of this new National Assembly. They want to establish their own independent government, and they do. They call it the Commune, and it's basically a revival of Robespierre's Jacobin Committee of Public Safety kind of era. It's a revival of Jacobinism. It only lasts 3 months, but it's a key moment. It's a key moment in history where it's patriotic, it's radically Republican, it advocates for social legislation like price controls and government protection of workers. Remember how when Robespierre got into power, he started putting price caps on all the bread, right? Same kind of idea. They're not exactly socialists, but more like radical Republicans. I mean, the differences are kind of like splitting hairs sometimes, but socialists and Marxists view the commune as a they're like, oh, maybe this is it. Maybe this is the first step in our socialist revolution. But lots of people, especially Bismarck, and even liberals in the UK, see the Commune as very dangerous, right? So fighting erupts in Paris between the Commune and the national government, and the National Army being mostly filled up with peasants, or lower middle class people from not from France, not from Paris. The National Army wins, and 20,000 of people loyal to the Commune are executed, and 7,500 deported. 20,000. 20,000 are executed. Remember, at the head of the Committee of Public Safety, 40,000 were executed at the guillotine. Right? I mean, first of all, what's this kid doing here? What's this kid doing here at the barricades? That's not safe. Second of all, 20,000 people are executed. I'll say it again, 20,000. That's a lot. Okay, so they get rid of the Commune. But the Third Republic is born in an atmosphere of class warfare, class and regional warfare, right? And to make matters worse, the monarchists are divided into factions, which basically leads the way for a vote to establish a republic that's gonna be contested, and it's gonna be hard, right? But it is a vote to establish a new national assembly after this whole Commune fiasco. They elect it by universal male suffrage, and there's going to be a limited power of the president and a Senate and a legislature, and the premier, the president must answer to the legislature, but the legislature is divided into basically a dozen parties. And it just kind of adds to this idea that the Third Republic, throughout its time period, even though it lasts for a long time, even though it lasts until about 1940, it never really works that great. It's not unstable, but it's just flimsy, and there's too many parties, and there's just a transitory sense of it all. And really, it's still the Napoleonic Code and Napoleon's reforms that are still kind of running strong, the strongest. Okay, so many problems in the French Republic, Third Republic. So there's the division between the monarchists and the republicans. The monarchists tend to be upper class, army officers, and supporters of the Catholic Church. The Republicans are pretty much everybody else. But over time, Republicans become less revolutionary and more popular because they basically realize that they can't be as radical. They have to kind of play the game. By 1879, they pass certain social reforms like free mandatory public school education, with the role of the church substantially reduced. Remember, with Louis Philippe, he tried to, and Napoleon III, he tried to instill the Falloux law, where the Catholics were still in charge of the schools. That's generally reduced. That's in 1879, but and I just wanted to show you this picture of people. Of students. This is 1887. Batanier Fleck. It's called Anagoria, but he's pointing to Alsace-Lorraine, and Alsace-Lorraine was lost to Germany in the Franco-Prussian War, and the loss of Alsace-Lorraine sticks in. Oh my goodness, that's misspelled. Alsace-Lorraine sticks in the craw of France really badly. They really want that territory back. So when we lead up to World War I, remember that basically this generation of kids is being taught that that's our land. That's our land. We should have that land back. Sorry, excuse me. So moving on to the French Third Republic in the 1880s, 1890s, a bunch of crises. Okay, and some of these are really important. there's the General Boulanger, you know, who tries. He's a monarchist, and he tries to kind of stage a coup d'état, but he flees. He's kind of, you know, kind of a side note. But it just, you know, there were guys like him that always wanted, you know, there were that thought of themselves as another Napoleon, right? General Boulanger. He wanted to maybe be Emperor Boulanger, but that's still there in France. That's kind of like that's still there. And then you have the Dreyfus Affair. The Dreyfus Affair is extremely, extremely important, not just for its anti-Semitism, but also because of the idea that France just had this complex after the Franco-Prussian War of being um, being defeated and kind of uh, searching for its glory again. If that makes any if that makes any sense. Oops, let me go back here. Um, so the Dreyfus Affair, 1894. Dreyfus was the first Alfred, I believe his first name. I'm blanking on that right now. But he was the first Jewish officer in the French army. This is a pretty big deal. But he is basically framed, like, you know, the story, as the story goes, a French spy who works in a German palace somewhere, you know, as a maid. She's like rummaging through the trash to like find anything that she can find, and she apparently finds evidence of, you know, someone back in France stealing French secrets and selling them to the Germans, right? So obviously this creates a brouhaha, but basically Dreyfus is framed for it. He's accused of espionage, found guilty in a secret trial. He's never allowed to see the evidence against him. The trial is ridiculously circumspect. The evidence is just kind of ridiculous. And this is a famous image of them stripping him of his rank, breaking his sword in public. It's a humiliating ritual, right? I mean, this is, you know, imagine like being all this, like, you know, standing here and having your sword broken, you know, having your rank stripped from you, and then being thrown in jail, not just, you know, in the Bastille or whatever local jail, but here in Devil's Island, right, where you have, he stayed here and in a room with no windows, in a ridiculously hot place that, you know, like basically he's in paradise, but he's like kept from paradise. I mean, like, think about the psychological torment that guy went through. So essentially, his evidence comes out though that he's innocent, and that this other guy, Major Esterhazy, is the one who was selling the secrets. But the army is incredibly anti-Semitic. It's monarchist. It's anti-Republican. They don't care. They refuse to open the case, right? And there's all these pamphlets and all these writings at the time, like, for example, La Libre Parole, right? I mean, this is, of course, anti-Semitic and disgusting, and it's France at the time, right? I mean, it's just, this is France right here, and they're refusing to reopen the case, and the famous novelist Émile Zola says, "J'accuse, I accuse you, Letter of the President of the Republic," from Émile Zola. He accuses he leads an impassioned campaign on the part of Dreyfus, saying, like, this is absolutely ludicrous that you are pinning all this stuff on this man. You're doing this basically because he's Jewish. Okay, so this is really the first. There is a lot of anti-Semitism left in Europe. And in the aftermath of the case, the Socialists and Republicans actually take the majority in the Chamber of Deputies, in the National Assembly, and they pass legislation that finally tries to, and finally ends all the provisions of Napoleon's Concordat with the Pope from 1801, and they finally are able to separate la separation. I don't know how to pronounce it, but separation of church and state, right? The image of Marianne, right? The tricolor flag and the clergyman. Finally, being able to separate church and state, and of course, the Pope retaliates by excommunicating all the members of the legislature who had voted for it. But the percentage of socialists grows, as well as the Republicans, and there's a bit more balance in the government after the Dreyfus affair. But remember that the Catholic Church in this time is like going backwards. It's going more conservative, like in 1870 or 1866 rather, or somewhere around there. You might have to relook it up, but the Pope issues the Syllabus of Errors, right, which basically denounces all liberal doctrine. He reestablishes the idea of papal infallibility. So there, and the church, the Catholic Church, uses modern techniques like propaganda, like printing, like advertising, really, all these new material techniques to spread the word of Catholicism and to try and reestablish itself. But it's also just going back to kind of these old tactics. So this is again secularization, but not secularization. Okay, so to finalizing the Third Republic of France, over time, and in spite of all the divisions and instability of the National Assembly coalitions and all that stuff, there starts to be a loyalty to the Third Republic from French people, largely because of this perception that France was wronged, that France was really kind of the idea of Alsace-Lorraine being part of France, and we need to get it back. So I just thought I would throw this in there. The Henri Rousseau, 1907. Yeah, just thought this was interesting, kind of like representing like loyalty to the French Republic. Like, we're doing the best we can. All these French flags in the windows, and look at all these representatives of foreign powers coming to greet the Republic as a sign of peace, right? Okay, moving on to, I'm sorry, this is going long. Moving on to Britain, Queen Victoria. Okay, she rules from 1838 to, 1901, something like that. I mean, just for 60 years. I mean, it's just amazing. Essentially, Britain is progress. Britain is progress. And how did it become more democratic during this time? Let's see. Okay. Essentially, the two great parties emerge in this time period, right? The conservatives, who used to be the Tories, and the liberals, who used to be the Whigs. Now, it's William Gladstone, who essentially trades with Benjamin Disraeli, like different times as prime minister. So Gladstone is the liberal / Whig. Disraeli is the conservative / Tory. Disraeli was really an interesting guy. He wrote a lot of novels. A great writer. He was. I mean, we can look it up him up in more detail when we do the roundtable. But they're both alternating. They alternate in power, like from different through the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s. And obviously, they're still representing the wealthy, right? They're not representing these guys, who didn't have to really work in the factories anymore by their time because of the Factory Acts of 1833 and 1844. Well, they did, but not, at least for not as long. But these guys are still representing the wealthy, right? The Tories are still representing the landed aristocracy, and the liberals, meaning the Whigs, are still mostly representing the commercial industrial interests, right? But they're both of these guys are expanding the suffrage. both of these guys. Under Disraeli in 1867, there's the Second Great Reform Bill, which doubles the amount of voters, including most workers. And then in 1884, under Gladstone, basically the suffrage expands again. So they're both expanding the vote slowly but surely, right? Which is the British way to do it. British they only adopt universal manhood suffrage in 1918. Okay, Gladstone does a bunch of different things, and listen carefully. First Public Education Act in 1870. He finally is the one who eliminates the Test Act, right? The elimination of religious tests for graduation from Oxford and Cambridge and for holding other like public offices, right? Remember the Test Act going back to around the time of the Glorious Revolution, that Catholics were barred from holding any kind of office or any kind of position in society because they were Catholic, right? He basically finally repeals the last vestige of the Test Act. He introduces the secret ballot. He legalizes labor unions. He reorganizes the army, the civil service, the judiciary branch. He is a great reformer, as well as Disraeli. He advocates for workers. He passes legislation to regulate working hours and housing conditions. And workers' compensation becomes part of the conversation. A shorter workday. And then after, after 1900, we have to start talking about the Labor Party as rising as a kind of more social democrat kind of party. The Liberal Party, to try and counteract the potential loss of labor support, becomes supporters of active intervention on behalf of workers by the state, right? Okay, so basically this guy, H.H. Asquith, and this guy, David Lloyd George, they see the rise of the Labor Party as kind of an opportunity to pass a more substantial social welfare package, right? This is eventually called the People's Budget of 1909, 1910. But this is major social welfare. This is like building the social welfare state as we know it today. Sickness insurance for when you get sick at work, accident insurance, old age, kind of social security ideas, unemployment insurance, the end of limitations on strikes, the establishment of labor exchanges. This becomes the Liberal Party's platform. Okay, so this is where you have the switch. This is where you have the switch between when the Labor Party starts to be an issue for the Liberal Party. The Liberal Party basically takes on all this social welfare stuff, and that's when the liberals become more like socialists. Like they kind of there's a little bit of socialism mixed in with liberalism. Now, the conservatives, and as you can see, like they introduce an inheritance tax, a progressive income tax, right? Like the idea of taxing the rich to provide for social welfare programs. In turn, the conservatives, the Tories, Disraeli's party, they take up the mantle of industry and laissez-faire economics, right? So they switch. This is where liberalism and conservatism kind of do their little switcheroo, okay? So I think that's important. The other final thing that the liberals do to finalize this kind of switch is that they pass legislation to reduce the power in the House of Lords to make sure that their legislation goes through. And then they also provide salaries for the members of parliament. This was one of the original Chartist demands, but salaries for members of parliament means that anybody can serve in parliament. You don't need to be someone from money in order to serve in parliament. Okay, so let's move on to this, the Irish question. Now, this I want to do a little bit of background on. Ireland, if you remember, is basically like the original colony. I say that down here. Ireland was England's first colony. Um, and Daniel O'Connell was essentially the first Irish patriot who tried to fight the union of Great Britain and Ireland in 1801. He tried to make it legal for Catholics to sit in Parliament, which is called Catholic Emancipation. And remember, during our Saturday review session, I mentioned Jonathan Swift's A Modest Proposal, which basically instructed the English to maybe we should just tell the Irish to eat their babies if they're hungry, or to sell them as food to the rich if they're so poor, right? I mean, Ireland was subjugated. Ireland was just treated awfully. There were absentee landlords that showed up to collect their rents and didn't care for their tenants. The potato famine of 1848, England did nothing to stop it or help it. They imposed the Church of Ireland on Ireland, which was an Anglican church, but most people were Catholics, so the Irish Catholics hated it. They had to pay tithes to it. And it's just, I mean, the list of grievances, both religious and economic, were long and bloody. For his part, Gladstone tried to help Ireland. He tried to ameliorate the tensions by disestablishing the Church of Ireland, which was a pretty big deal. And so, you know, there's reforms made in this time period vis-a-vis the Irish question. Okay, so there's a bit of progress, but the Irish want home rule, and home rule meaning Sinn Féin. This is the organization. Arthur Griffith forms Sinn Féin, which means we ourselves, in 1905, and eventually home rule was granted in 1914, and then suspended, and then kind of given, and then suspended, and they're going to go through kind of fits and starts with this, but Sinn Féin becomes a very important kind of a little bit more radical group, and this Gladstone's willingness to help Ireland kind of helps split the Liberal Party, and gives more power to the Labour Party, or lets it rise. So Ireland is kind of the thorn in the Liberal side, even though they're trying to help. So the other part of this is that when the idea of home rule is established, there's violent protests from the Ulstermen up here in Ulster, which is this part of Ireland. Basically, it's Irish Protestants who don't want home rule because that would make them the minority. So they are like, no, we don't want that. They remain a part of Great Britain until 1922, or actually in 1922, when Ireland gets Dominion status, they remain a part of Great Britain. So there's going to be problems with this. Okay, so lastly, let's move on to Germany, and we'll try and finish this up in the next 7 minutes. Okay, so I guess this would have been an 80-minute period, right? Okay, so Germany. Oh, let's get back up here. Remember, 1870 unifies. Still a federal state. Got all these different princes and kings. It's still a federal state, but all of them are now serving the emperor of Germany, and the emperor becomes Kaiser Wilhelm II. I believe in the 1880s, late 1880s. And look at, first of all, that mustache is awesome. That's an awesome mustache right there. Like the upward. I've never seen that before. I don't know how he does that. Okay, so remember, this is a federal state, but everybody's basically okay with Bismarck calling and the Kaiser calling the shots. Okay, but Bismarck has kind of this realpolitik imperative where he's like, I'm going to make sure that I keep the facade of democracy, right? And I'm going to make sure that I use universal manhood suffrage for stuff, even if I'm still the guy, running things, right? So it's a federal state. Individual member states keep their rulers and traditions. There's the parliament elected by universal malehood suffrage, but the parliament's really just for show. The Reichstag, right? That's the Reichstag, is the parliament. So Bismarck is essentially running the show. He relied, essentially he tries to rely on whoever he can, without interference from pretty much anybody else. He does have to answer to the Junkers every once in a while, but also he has liberalism growing in Prussia, and he has a lot. So he has a lot to deal with. Okay, so two major domestic battles that we should just kind of clarify. The first is a resurgence of Catholicism, especially down here in Bavaria and these areas, because this is still Austria. This down here, there's a resurgence of Catholicism, and Bismarck launches the Kulturkampf, meaning culture war. When Hitler later issues Mein Kampf, my struggle, it's essentially, like, you can interpret it different ways. A Kulturkampf, a culture war, culture struggle. He launches it against the Catholic Church because the Catholic Church is essentially who you're going to be loyal to. Are you going to be loyal to the Pope, or are you going to be loyal to the Kaiser? Right. That's what he's going after. So he launches a Kulturkampf against the Center Party, which is the Catholic political party, and liberals in Prussia support Bismarck because they're anti-clerical, right? Liberalism is all about, separation of church and state and reason and all that stuff. So they're anti-clerical. They support Bismarck, passing restrictions on Catholic influence on education. They expel the Jesuits. But this is kind of a bad move by Bismarck, because the other battle that he has to face, the other domestic battle that he has to face, is against another rising party called the German Social Democratic Party, the SPD. Now, this is the major party that will have lasting effects into World War II, and yeah, it's moderate socialism, and he then rescinds basically all the stuff that he was doing against the Catholic Church and the Center Party with the Kulturkampf, in order to bring them back into the fold, in order to try and stop these guys and trying to stop the Social Democratic Party. He tries to squelch socialism by making their public meetings and their newspapers illegal. He drives the party underground, and he basically tries to, and this is where Bismarck tries to do social welfare. He tries to create a social welfare state in Prussia, basically in order to placate the socialists. Like, he enacts major social welfare legislation, like social insurance and workers' compensation in the 1880s. Basically, it's just like the program that's placed by liberals in Britain some 20 years later. All these guys that I was talking about, like David Lloyd George and Asquith, Bismarck tries to do all that in Germany in order to fight the Social Democratic Party. Therefore, it becomes the most advanced state on the social welfare front, which is really, really interesting. So this campaign against socialism lasts for 12 years, but it ends in utter failure. And in 1890, the elections, the number of SPD deputies was larger than before the ban. So that's not very good. So in 1890, the new Kaiser, that's when he came to power, 1890. New Kaiser Wilhelm II, he decides to take the helm by himself and his awesome mustache. He decides to take Bismarck out. Essentially, he makes Bismarck step down, and that's when this is the dropping the pilot. This is the dropping the pilot cartoon where here's Kaiser Wilhelm II, and he's steering the ship, and he's letting Bismarck off. And Bismarck's going to go into his little dinghy, the rival mustaches. But essentially, he makes German foreign policy a bit more aggressive and a bit more ambitious, but domestic policy he makes more conciliatory, more agreeable. The anti-socialist laws and the Social Democratic Party, and it grows so much so that by 1912 it had won about a third. It had won about a third of the votes in the legislature, in the Reichstag, and it becomes the single largest party in Germany. So this is a big deal when Kaiser Wilhelm gets rid of Bismarck and kind of embraces a more liberal approach, a more laissez-faire approach to politics. Okay. So a few other things, and just finishing up here. In Italy, there's industrialization, and there's a constitutional monarchy set up. The Pope and the Italian state remain at odds, and there's a working class created really by industrialization by 1912 especially. Illiteracy and poverty, but are still widespread. And these two guys, the Annunzio and Marinetti, declare the La Figaro Manifesto, and this idea of futurism, which is a ridiculously anti-democratic but fervently nationalist and strongly emotional appeal to nationalism, and to just it's a little disturbing because it's basically a precursor of fascism, right? This is when we look at the roots of fascism. This is where we'll want to remember this create a new movement called futurism, kind of looking to the future and progress at all costs kind of thing. Going back to Austria and Hungary, Franz Joseph, still awesome mustache. Basically, they have the dual monarchy now, individual parliaments of the dual monarchy. They're limited to, the Austrian legislature is Austria and the Hungarian legislature is Hungary. And Franz Joseph pretty much controls all foreign and military policy without any input from the legislatures. And Austria achieves universal manhood suffrage in 1907, but not Hungary. Not Hungary yet. And of course, Hungary is still dealing with all the nationality issues, all the ethnic issues. So let's see. A few states in this time period allowed women to vote, but it's only Finland and Norway. Nobody of major great power yet. And then the last thing is that in about, I believe it's in the early 1900s, maybe late 1800s, Russia finally has some kind of national legislature called the Duma, D-U-M-A. Okay, so to sum this all up, there is still a vast part of Europe that is still monarchy and still dominated by landed aristocrats. Eastern Europe, right? Russia, Austria, Hungary, it's still very, outer zone, still monarchical, still landed aristocrats. Spain as well. Only Britain and France had states with significant popular control. Remember that even Germany, it's the facade of popular control. It's not really popular control. Nevertheless, there's still the extension of suffrage. There's still political parties being formed. The masses are still beginning to participate politically. Democracy is spreading. very slowly, but it is spreading. Constitutionalism is advancing, just very slowly. And the biggest thing in this time period, the Queen Victorian era, and I want to watch a video on Queen Victoria, is that, I mean, Britain is just, in terms of economics, it's just they control the whole thing. They control, the sun never sets on the British Empire. I mean, from this picture to Lipton tea to the idea of Lloyd's of London. I mean, oil being discovered in Iran in 1908. I mean, England is still the main, I mean, it's still Pax Britannica. This is Pax Britannica. The idea that Britain has stabilized the idea of what it means to be modern and has set the benchmark for what it means to be modern. So that is chapter 14 in a nutshell. I did not definitely like touch on everything that is political or economic in the years between 1871 and 1914. It's way too much, but we basically have the logistics. We have the skeleton, and now we can start putting on the sinews and the muscles with all the cultural and social ideologies that are coming out that we will discuss in chapter 15 and 16. And all the imperialism stuff that is really fascinating with the scramble for Africa and the exploration of the rest of the world and the subjugation of Asia and Africa especially, that will lead to incredibly complicated and frustrating patterns of decolonization and war in the 20th century. All the economic and political advancements that are made in this time period, all of them make things more complicated in the 20th century when Europe tears itself apart in the world wars. Okay, so I'll see you guys soon.